I think, Jim, you're exactly right. Of course, the U.S. could, if it wanted to, quote, lead by actually doing something constructive rather than totally defensive in using the veto. What's happening in the UN, of course, is nearly complete isolation of the US and Israel vis-a-vis the rest of the world. In the Security Council, with the 15 votes, the most recent call for a ceasefire went 13 to 1 to 1. So 13 members voted for a ceasefire. The United States vetoed that call, and the UK, ever loyal, abstained. And by the way, abstained even though the public pressures in the UK to stop this massacre are actually quite strong on the streets, with mass demonstrations taking place regularly in London. Then the vote went to the UN General Assembly under a doctrine that when there is a paralysis in the Security Council, it can be taken up by the UN General Assembly in a operational move that Dean Acheson actually established a little over 70 years ago, called Uniting for Peace. So it went to the UN General Assembly, and there the vote was 153 calling for an immediate ceasefire, 10 opposed, the United States, Israel, and 8 small countries, and 23 abstaining, with 7 very small countries not voting for one reason or another. Maybe their representative wasn't actually in New York or something like that. So the vote was 153 yes, 10 opposed, and 23 abstaining. If you calculate the populations in each of those categories, turns out that in the 153 governments that voted for the immediate ceasefire, that's 89% of the world's population in the countries of those 153 votes. The countries in the no vote, the US category, is 5% of the world population, of which the US is 4%, and the other 9 countries, Israel, Guatemala, Paraguay, and some really small islands, that turns out to be 5% total, and we're 4% of that. So the countries that joined the US on the vote constitute 1% of the world population. Then the abstentions is another 5% of the world population in those 23 countries. And then the 7 not voting is a little under 1%. So you get 100%. And my point is, just to finish the point, the US is essentially isolated now. That isolation is going to actually intensify in the coming weeks. The US is basically, Israel always says, we don't care. You're all a bunch of anti-Semites or whatever they claim. But the United States does care. To be completely alone in the world, other than with Israel, really hurts American interests all over the world. And that's what's actually happening right now. So my view is this pressure is going to continue to intensify. We're seeing a mass slaughter every day, and the vote isn't going to be 153 next time. It's going to be 165 next time, or 170, because we see even the likes of the UK, France, Germany saying we need a ceasefire now because they're hearing it from their own publics. So the United States is basically standing alone next to Israel, and that's it.
Dr. Sachs, why hasn't there any effective carrot and stick policy with Israel? Like, we've only seen reward after reward, but we haven't seen.
Yes, there is no stick, because the American politicians want to show that they're on the side of Israel. That's been their traditional modus operandi. And this is the main point. They're starting to realize it doesn't work. doesn't work for geopolitics. It doesn't work for their own vote. It doesn't work for the public. So I think that there is some worry, because also what's happening, what we see on the videos, what we see in the television every day is beyond shocking. It's mass murder of a civilian population in broad, clear daylight. No murmur of attempt at diplomacy by Israel. Quite the contrary, a complete denial of any intention of Palestinian rights now or after the fighting. Quite the contrary, Netanyahu came out and said, well, Oslo process, that was a mistake. We will never allow the Palestinian Authority to have control over Gaza. We will keep control over Gaza. In other words, it's vulgar, and it is a war for Israel to have full control over everything. And if that means mass slaughter and ethnic cleansing, Israel will go ahead. The question is, will the United States provide the munitions each day for this? And as I say, the training of these politicians is, yes, don't show space with Israel. That's been the way for decades. The vulgarity of this and the criminality of it, and the fact that it doesn't play with the public, and the isolation of the United States in the world, will force a re-examination of these basic precepts. And how fast or not that will happen is exactly what we're seeing right now. I'm trying to do anything I can to see more votes that show the U.S. isolation, that draw clearly that this is the whole world speaking out for justice and for stopping of the war. The American politicians, they have a high tolerance for people being killed. They've been killing people for a long, long time, but not in such a vivid way on the screen, so clear every day.
There is one point, but I'll come back and just sure. As a follow-up to this. There is one point that I don't think may, or I don't know if it's being made enough. I'd love to get your take on it. But one of the biggest arguments that Israel has in the, to the international community, its right to defend itself, and I get that point, but in looking at some of the numbers that came out of the 2006 war in Lebanon, and the crucial role that the UN played through resolution number 1701, highlights a couple of really interesting points. One, between the year 1982 and 2000, when Israel was occupying the south of Lebanon, there were about, I think, 12 to 1,300 soldiers, Israeli soldiers, that were killed. From 2000 to 2022, 23, that number went down by about 97.5% to, I think, 28, if you put aside the 2006 war. 2006 war essentially was a war for the release of Lebanese prisoners. They took the 2 soldiers, and ultimately, even though the war ended up doing a lot of destruction and death as usual, the prisoners were exchanged, and all of the Lebanese prisoners were released from Israeli prisons. Now, interestingly, the lesson from that war is between 2006 and 2023, the border has been, I'd say, relatively quiet. Some flare-ups here and there, but nothing major. They even signed an oil and gas deal just last year. One of the points that I think is missing, and I'd love to get your take on it, is if the Land for Peace model were to be reconsidered, there is a proof point that it works, and it still works. It worked in Egypt, it worked in Jordan, it worked in Lebanon, and it reduced from the amount of Israeli deaths, as proven by a 97.5% drop in the amount of dead Israeli soldiers. I'd love to get your take on this and the important role that the UN, through 1701 and so many other resolutions, played in making it happen, and whether there is such an opening now, notwithstanding the U.S. reticence to actually, to go for it along UN lines.
Well, you make a very good point, and it is, of course, my own position that we should move immediately to the two-state outcome. My own proposal is that the UN Security Council should immediately vote Palestine as the 194th UN member state. It could do that in principle next week, because Palestine made its application in September 2011. It's been pending for a dozen years. The first application was blocked by the United States. Palestine accepted observer status under US pressure. But now I think under the current realities, the Security Council should try, and probably the US would veto it, but I would try anyway, for an immediate recognition of Palestine as the 194th UN member state based on the borders of the 4th of June, 1967, as called for by all relevant UN Security Council resolutions going back to 242 and 338 and many, many others since then. So this is what I would recommend, and I do think that it could lead to peace. And of course, the fact is that the Arab Peace Initiative, which was first launched in 2002, is exactly predicated on this. The Arab states have said repeatedly, we will normalize relations with Israel, we will make peace with Israel, based on a two-state solution on the 4 June 1967 borders. And when the Arab and Islamic leaders met in Riyadh about a month ago now and issued the declaration, they cited the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, which has been repeated many times since then, and they reiterated in their own words. And importantly, that included Iran as well as the Arab countries, that peace is possible. There needs to be an immediate end to the fighting, and there needs to be a state of Palestine, sovereign and with the borders of June 4, 1967. So this, to my mind, is the right approach. Now, why isn't it happening? Well, it's not happening precisely because this government in Israel, and arguably just about every government of the last 50 years, isn't really interested in that kind of peace. They're not really looking fundamentally for that kind of security in which they have a normalization of relations with Arab countries based on two states. They're really looking for one state. They're really looking for one state, that is Israel, which, as they say, using biblical terms, includes not only present-day Israel, but also Judea and Samaria, meaning the West Bank, and Gaza. And so that's what this is about. Of course, what's happened in Israel over the last 50 years is that it's become more and more and more right-wing and extreme nationalist. And the Netanyahu government is an extremist government by any account. It's not even close. There's nobody in the government that talks about two states. Quite the contrary. Netanyahu said very explicitly, no way to two states. And some of the senior cabinet ministers, like the finance minister Smotrich, he calls himself a fascist, by the way. Maybe in a jocular way, but he says fascist. Yeah, sure. And his party is the party for so-called Greater Israel. What does Greater Israel mean? It means that Israel will control all of the territory of Palestine and present-day Israel. So this is very deep politically. You have Gallant, the finance minister. You have Ben-Gvir. You have Smotrich. You have Netanyahu. These are the leaders. They're not fighting a war for Hamas. They are fighting a war for Israel to have full control over Gaza and the West Bank. And that's why they're not saying, well, if Hamas would somehow be defeated, we'd go to a two-state solution. Exactly the opposite. And this makes what they're doing not only war crimes per se, but
nonsensical,
all the more vile. There's no endpoint to it. It's pure war, pure ethnic cleansing, and that is their vision.
Right now, we are seeing that the United States and Israel are, it seems that they are preparing to fight Yemen Houthis. How serious is that in your opinion, and why they're doing this?
Well, the whole situation is very serious because there is no end game in sight. Israel is trying to impose solutions in the region that are unacceptable. First, domination over Palestine in an unconditional way through its military power backed by the United States, and it's making threats against other parts of the Middle East. So this could obviously spiral into a wider war very soon. And it's all premised on Israeli government policies that are, in my opinion, flagrantly against international law and international decency.
Why the United States, why the Biden administration, instead of going after negotiation, finding some political solution to this issue, they're prepared to do everything, whatever the Netanyahu administration is asking for?
This is a neocon policy to fight wars anywhere and everywhere, to always escalate, and to believe that not only does might make right, but that might can solve political issues. It's pathetic, but it's not really different from other dimensions of U.S. policy. It's just blatant, flagrant arrogance and disregard for international law and disregard for what global opinion and American opinion say. After all, the world overwhelmingly has called for a ceasefire. And in the most recent UN General Assembly vote, it was 153 countries calling for a ceasefire, and the population of those countries is 89% of the world population. 10 countries opposed: the United States, Israel, and a few other small countries. The total population of those that opposed was 5%, of which 4% was the United States. So the US was joined by 9 other countries that represented less than 1% of the world population. In other words, this is giving a finger, if I could put it crudely, to the rest of the world, saying, we don't care. We don't care what you say. We don't care what you call for. We don't care for peace. We'll do it the way we want to do it. This is not only the United States backing Israel, this is the United States alongside Israel, because Israel couldn't fight one day by itself. It needs the munitions every day from the United States, and it's getting them.
Yeah, you talk about ammunition. Jake Sullivan just recently said that they are taking care of this ammunition, these weapons that are sending to Israel, that they are not using against civilians.
Well, this is ridiculous. There are 18,000 dead minimum, 2 million displaced, hospitals, schools, basic physical infrastructure, apartment buildings, all destroyed. And even the New York Times, which is, of course, rabidly pro-Israel, and I mean pro-Israeli government policy, notes in an article today that a substantial proportion of the bombs are dumb bombs. They're not guided bombs. They even quote Mark Milley, the former chief of staff of the U.S. military, saying that this is wrong. You need to use guided missiles to avoid the civilian deaths and damage and injury. And of course, they're not doing that. Does Jake Sullivan know that? Of course, he knows that. This is part of a U.S. foreign policy that is as out of control as Israel's foreign policy. That's the problem.
The other issue that it's much more serious than Yemen is Hezbollah in the north. Israelis, they were talking about if it was necessary, they want to attack Hezbollah. Hezbollah has the same rhetoric. How do you see right now the situation in that region?
It seems, although I don't have any direct evidence because I don't speak to the administration, they certainly don't speak to me, but it seems that the hardliners in Washington and the hardliners in Jerusalem in the Israeli government want a wider war. They're not taking steps to avoid a wider war. They seem to want a wider war. I think it's Netanyahu's dream that the United States goes to war with Iran. Because if Israel could get the United States to take out Iran, and that's their idea, imagine that. But all of this is grotesque cynicism and miscalculation as well, because what could happen would be devastating for the whole world if this continues to escalate. And they're playing with that. You notice that Israel hasn't taken one moment, not one measure, not one iota of an approach towards diplomacy. Nothing. No call for diplomacy. Incredible disrespect for the United Nations, disrespect for the rest of the world. Obviously saying every day we don't care about the rest of the world. We don't care about diplomacy. I think one of the things that will happen is that support in the United States for Israel will collapse. Actually, it's already collapsing among young people, and I think the collapse will be more widespread. Even that doesn't necessarily stop the U.S. government from doing what it's doing by any means, because foreign policy is hardly an area of democratic deliberation. It's a small cabal that runs things, that controls the military. They don't really ask for permission. But we see in Ukraine how an exasperated public finally has some influence on some members of Congress enough that there isn't just a blank check for more armaments. This is very surprising given how much our Congress likes to write checks to the military industrial complex. But the public is pretty much disgusted, and Biden's support is falling sharply. We have an election year this year, so it's possible that the exasperation clearly expressed in opinion survey after opinion survey will finally result in some action by the U.S. government to put a stop to this massive devastation.
At the end of the day, what is so important is how these actions would benefit the people of Israel. What's going on in the mind of the Netanyahu administration? How possibly they can think that all these actions would benefit Israelis?
They are engaged in ethnic cleansing right now, and that is the goal of this government. This government is an extreme right-wing government. Netanyahu's party, the Likud, has, since its charter in 1977, demanded one state of Israel, commanding all of the territories of Palestine, as well as the 1967 border Israel. In other words, the land from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River should be Israel. That's the policy. That's the policy across the cabinet. That's the policy of these religious Zionist parties. For example, the finance minister Smotrich and the defense minister Gallant, who's Likud, and the interior minister Ben-Gvir, who is another party calling for, quote, greater Israel. That's their policy, is that there should never be a Palestine, there should never be Palestinian political rights. This is Israel. And a lot of the public supports that. And a lot of the public follows the line of the administration, the Israeli government, that is, that the only way to safety is to smash Palestine. And so the situation is going to continue, I think, if it's a matter of internal Israeli policy. But it's something that Israel can't do for a day without the United States. And the U.S. has no interest, no national interest, no ethical interest, no geopolitical interest in being an accessory to mass murder.
How do you see the left, the center political parties in Israel? Because the left is so weak right now. Why the Netanyahu administration during all these years did this to the left, to the center?
There's basically no left in Israel. It's a few seats in the Knesset, in the parliament. The Israeli political scene has shifted to the far right over the years. It didn't just start on October 7. This is something that's been going on for years. Netanyahu represents and those parties represent a larger viewpoint. Israel's basically divided between those who oppose a Palestinian state because they think that God gave them all the land and they're going to assert their biblical claim, and those who follow the propaganda that say, well, even if it was right to have two states, there's no one on the other side that would accept that, and so better we have to use violence and force. That's the only realistic thing to do. But voices that say we need to solve these problems through following international law and through justice barely exist in Israel right now. I think this is a terrible, grave danger to Israel's survival, because the legitimacy internationally is plummeting. And I personally don't think that the American people really have much interest in being a party to this. The American people, to the extent that they signed up with Israel, signed up to a two-state solution. They did not sign up to some biblical vision of a greater Israel that controls millions of Palestinian people. They didn't sign up for that.
Putin's recent press conference, he was talking about Odessa. He said that Odessa is a Russian city. It's a huge change in his view. The United States could have saved Odessa for Ukraine if they were going to negotiate with Russia before. How do you see the situation right now in Ukraine? Is there any will in the Biden administration to go after negotiations?
No. In 2010, 2011, 2013, Russia's demands vis-a-vis Ukraine were that Ukraine should be neutral. That's all. And Russia negotiated with the government of Ukraine a lease till the year 2042 for Sevastopol naval base. There were no demands for annexation. There were no demands for territory. There was no claim on Crimea. There was simply a pragmatic approach. Don't join the U.S. military alliance, and our military base, our naval base, which has been in Sevastopol, Crimea, since 1783, should remain there, and we want a long-term lease for that, which President Yanukovych negotiated. That's all the demands. Then the United States overthrew, or was party to the overthrow of Yanukovych. Russia took back Crimea. Even then, there were no demands for the eastern Ukrainian regions, that is the Donbass. What Russia said was stop killing ethnic Russians, give autonomy to ethnic Russians, and that became the basis for the so-called Minsk I and Minsk II agreements. The Minsk II agreement did not call for independence of the Donbass or that Russia would annex the Donbass. It just said autonomy. And it was a position backed up unanimously by the UN Security Council. But the United States said, no, we don't care. Told Ukraine, you don't have to implement that. And so that was lost. Even as late as December 2021, Putin was not making demands for territory. He was calling for the Minsk agreements to be enforced, claiming Crimea and demanding that NATO stop enlarging. Well, the United States government is deaf to the interests of any other place in the world. They're so arrogant that the position is we don't have to listen to anything. And so when President Putin put a draft security agreement on the table based on those premises that NATO would not enlarge, that the Minsk agreement would be honored finally years after it was supposed to go into effect, Biden said, nah, we don't have to negotiate. Russia launched its special military invasion in March 2022, and by then the Duma, the Russian parliament, had recognized eastern Ukraine as independent, Lugansk and Donetsk as independent, did not annex them. That came in September 2022. But in March, it recognized their independence, but Russia demanded Ukrainian neutrality and said on that basis there could be immediate peace. And Ukraine and Russia famously were close to an agreement on ending the war weeks after it had started, weeks. And the United States said no, and Britain said no. We will not support you. You fight on. Hundreds of thousands of people, Ukrainian young men, have died since then. So this is about American foreign policy, and it's so sad. It is not just demands for territory by Russia. It is the fact that Russian demands keep rising in the context of continuing rejections from the United States. Definitely, the rhetoric has turned even more aggressive, but the White House is so stupid. Sorry, in the US, they don't understand anything. But what they certainly don't understand is that Biden should call Putin and say, we've got to stop this. We don't want to see all of Ukraine destroyed. But you're right. We should never have tried to expand NATO. That was really stupid. And you told us that since 2007. That's the call that's needed. But I don't think Biden's up to it. And certainly his neocon team opposes that very premise. Fight on, basically kidnap young people off the streets of Ukrainian cities and throw them to the front line where they're dying by the hundreds, sometimes 1,000 or more per day. That's the policy. Well, I would put it a different way. They would like, I believe, nothing more than for the U.S. to become embroiled in a war with Iran. This is, I think, part of the goal. A wider war, we shouldn't think, is something that Israel is trying to avoid. It may well be something that Israel is trying to provoke. This is rather typical of, I don't know who the client is. I was going to say a client state manipulating a great power. I'm not sure who really the client is here, but Israel manipulates the United States, and it's happy it's got those aircraft carriers in the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, and now it is hoping, I think, that this could be the chance of Netanyahu's long-held desire that the United States would join a war against Iran. So we shouldn't think of this as a miscalculation on their part. Of course, it would be, again, unimaginably horrific. It could escalate into everything because it could bring in other superpowers, and probably would bring in Russia. Who knows what would happen? And let's be clear, there are lots of fools in the US that also won't mind a wider war. We've got a warmongering group in the Senate, Lindsey Graham types and others, who always want expanded war. So we shouldn't think of this as a miscalculation. We should think of this as a provocation. If it's maybe the ethnic cleansing will work, maybe it will lead to a wider war. Either way, not so bad, says Israel. Of course, their real miscalculation is a different one, and I think it is a very serious one. They're losing the United States. Israel is losing the United States. They don't get that. Just like Biden can't imagine doing anything against Israel, the Israeli leaders think they own the Congress and the US political system, and that is coming to an end, and they do not get that. Just like our Congress doesn't understand our students, Israel certainly doesn't understand what's happening inside the United States right now. And Israel can't go on a day with this without the United States backing it in munitions and backing it diplomatically and geopolitically. So I do think Israel's making a huge miscalculation. I think they're making a cruel calculation to start with, of course, but they're making a huge miscalculation, but not exactly the one that you're pointing to. They're making a miscalculation that they have the United States in their pocket, so they can basically think of the US military as theirs to throw against whatever enemy they want. That is a falsehood. They're going to learn the hard way. I think, in fact, if this continues in this horrific way, the two-state solution really will be gone, and Israel's very survival in the long term will be deeply threatened by the approach that Israel has taken. I see no disaster greater than Netanyahu. He's really, really a piece of work that has done untold damage to Israel in his tenure as prime minister.
And it wouldn't be the first time.
Well, he sees the end possibly coming.
For himself.
Say, Jim, go ahead, please.
Well, he sees the end possibly coming, but it's his life's work preventing a Palestinian state.
Exactly.
And one of the things you brought up, and you may be right. All of this is planned. I don't like to engage in conspiracy theories, but was it all planned in order to lead to another Nakba where Palestinians could be expelled out of Israel? And certainly some cabinet ministers have basically proposed that, saying that Western countries should accept Palestinians in to give them shelter so that they have a future in another place, because they don't want them to have a future. But you tried to talk a little bit before the United Nations about what we need to do to rebuild. The day, even if, let's just suppose that there is a ceasefire coming, and what do we do on day 2? Gaza is all but gone. You talked about getting 10% of the defense budgets of leading countries around the globe to invest in a sustainable reconstruction of Gaza and the Palestinian occupied territories. But, how do you get people to go along with that? Because remember, when they're doing deficit spending, somebody's benefiting, meaning Raytheon, at Omnia. They're benefiting from all of these wars. And if you stop that, if you take away 10% of that, that is a lot of money.
People are going to suffer for years and decades out of what is happening in these days, without question. The loss of life, but the destruction of hundreds of thousands of homes, the dislocation of 2 million people so far. This is devastating, and the destruction in Gaza will have a price tag that under any circumstances the world will not cover. So people will suffer and will be dislocated and impoverished and without any ultimate solution or compensation to this. But what will happen, and it will drive me crazy, by the way, thank God the day the fighting stops, then we'll have a donors conference. And the governments will get together and say, oh, we're going to commit tens of billions of dollars to rebuild what was just destroyed. And it's so stupid that we behave this way, because a lot of my life and career is about trying to raise any funds for impoverished people, getting kids in school, building health clinics. And the idea that you bomb places and then throw the tens or hundreds of billions of dollars at what you just willfully destroyed, but you would never come up with such funding for just helping poor people in the first place is the reality. And remember, it's as we muse about who's going to rebuild Gaza, and the answer is nobody is going to rebuild much of it. The Ukrainians, they actually hold meetings thinking, oh, we're going to have a $750 billion fund for the reconstruction of Ukraine. Yeah, good luck with that one too. So this is tragedy compounding tragedy. Of course, we have a doctrine in general in economics, an incentive doctrine, which is the polluter pay principle, which is you make the damage, you pay. That's how our courts work also. If it's a trespass or a noxious tort, a public nuisance is the legal term. Israel should pay for this. It destroyed Gaza. It should pay for this. Well, let's try that one. That one's not going to go too well either. But that is that's the principle that should apply, so that a government thinks twice before it destroys another place.
So it's interesting because it moves us. There's a couple of areas I'd like us to cover as we're kind of nearing the end of this great, interview, Jeff. One area is the economics of war and peace, and I'd love to. For you to comment on the juxtaposition that we're seeing now. On the one hand, you've got the utter destruction of Gaza, which is a fairly small place. I mean, Gaza is not this massive World War II kind of Marshall Plan for Western Europe. It's just basically the size, less than the size of Manhattan, I mean, in the grand scheme of things. However, on the other end, you've got a damaged Israeli economy that's basically shedding hundreds of millions of dollars on a daily basis. By an estimate, it's about $12 billion worth of economic, well, that's not opportunity cost, that's direct cost to the war so far in the 60 days. Add to that the opportunity cost for the 300,000 reservists. And
the destruction of the shipping now, which is blocked in the Red Sea, and ships turning away, all of that.
And you're seeing a reduction. Even Israelis are starting to leave, which is fascinating. I was reading somewhere that between 300 and 400,000 Israeli, presumably productive ones that don't want to waste their time on nonsensical wars, they're going to go to the West and be productive and safe with their families and stuff. So you've got that also going up. And in parallel, and I know you were just in Doha not long ago in the Gulf, and you're seeing this unbelievable wealth creation that is happening in Saudi, where essentially there's been a doubling of productivity just by allowing women to enter into the workforce. And you've got, all that going on in the Gulf, just a complete buildup of that. And if we look at some of the demographics, we're looking at what maybe 20 years ago, the Arab world was about 220 million. Now we're about 470 million. And by some projections, the MENA region is going to be 770 million by 2050. And you're seeing this juxtaposition, of these stories. How do you see that playing out, And can really Israel sustainably, from an economic perspective, still sell itself as being this strategic beachhead for the United States at a time when the United States, if it so wanted, has an entire region that's larger than the actual landmass of the United States itself, with potential 770 million people that it can alienate or pacify. I mean, how do you see that in your mind playing out?
Well, I think there are a number of issues here. First, this is very, very costly for Israel, and that's good because maybe it means that Israel will stop what it's doing. Israel cannot afford, ultimately, the greater Israel approach, which is the approach of ethnic cleansing or continued apartheid over the West Bank and Gaza. It doesn't know that yet. It can't sustain U.S. backing for that. It can't sustain the isolation that will come from that. It can't sustain the ongoing fighting that will come from that. So that's one part. More generally, war is, a good business for 5 companies in the military-industrial complex in the United States, but for the world, it's a totally rotten business, of course. Not only does it create tragedy, but it creates mass destruction that is extremely costly to pick up, and the direct outlays on armaments worldwide now is probably $2.5 to $3 trillion. The estimate is about $2.5 trillion, of which the United States is typically measured at $1 trillion, but it's actually much larger than that when you count all of the budget item lines, maybe up to $1.5 trillion a year. So this is all costly, all wasteful. I every day invoke Isaiah, the 8th century prophet whose words are on the wall just across the street of the UN on First Avenue, chapter 2, they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations won't make war on nations, neither will they learn war anymore. He's speaking economically. We should be transforming our armaments into productive activities. This is unbelievable waste, stupidity, and danger, what we're doing. Again, these wars could end essentially immediately, because I also like to quote Karl von Clausewitz, the war theorist in Germany after the Napoleonic Wars, who said that war is the continuation of politics with other means. And his point was that war is a kind of politics. So I say, look to the underlying politics. The underlying politics of the war in Gaza is, will there be a Palestinian state or will there be greater Israel? Well, the only answer that can possibly lead to peace is a Palestinian state. And we should cut to the chase and go straight there. As I mentioned, when we look at the war in Ukraine, the underlying politics is the United States trying to push its military to the border of Russia, to surround Russia in the Black Sea, an idea that Zbigniew Brzezinski described in detail in 1997, and that the US has been trying to carry out. It's led to disaster. Again, it's politics. So if we want to stop the war, it's not military that will do it, it's politics that will end these wars, and they could end immediately. We'd save a fortune. The people in the world would be hugely benefited. Of course, those under the bombs first and foremost, but all of us would benefit. Maybe Lockheed or Raytheon shares would go down a little bit. That would be just fine.
Can I ask a question about Lebanon?
Go ahead, Tariq. And there is one question I wanted to get a comment from Jeffrey on.
About Lebanon and the situation in Lebanon and the resolution, UN resolution 1701. Now it's back on the table, and Amos 16 is being back and forth to trying to implement borderline under Resolution 1701. Any information on that and the IMF plan for recovery of Lebanon? What do you have for Lebanon? What do you would like to say for the Lebanese audience about these two topics?
I
need another hour.
I wish I could help you on that more specifically, but precisely while that debate has been going on, I was at COP28 and then in Ethiopia, just got back yesterday. So my consultations with diplomats on that start this week.
Would you comment on COP28? What's your take on it? And do you think, as is being reported, it's at least an acceptable move forward? Did it disappoint you in terms of its reach, or were you actually surprised given that it was held in in an OPEC, at the end of the day, in an OPEC nation, and something did come out of it at the end?
I was glad that it was held in the Gulf region, and I think the president of COP28, Sultan Al Jaber, did a very good job, and the outcome is, as these things go, good. Now, I say as these things go because there's paper and then there's reality. And the paper document that came out is a step forward, definitely. The reality is that the big powers are all directed at these war and peace issues, not at this climate issue. And until we end these wars, we're not going to get the kind of real political capital to decarbonize the world economy, to face up to the financing challenges, and so forth. So I go to COP meetings, all these Conference of the Parties each year, and they're big, interesting jamborees. There were nearly 100,000 people there. A true measure of massive world interest, massive business interest, massive civil society interest, massive scientific interest. But in terms of superpower politics, that's not where the real answers are. And right now, the superpowers are in conflict and in war, and we've got to end that so that they focus on something absolutely real, which is making the planet viable from a climate point of view for the 21st century.
Well, Jeff, I think, I don't know if any of my colleagues has any more questions, but I do have one last question for you. And it's something that I heard you say, which was, obviously I've known you for a long time, but it's still impressive. It's you stated, and I quote, "Peaceful coexistence is about mutual respect, not to believe that one is the chosen one to rule in a particular place or to rule in every place." And I thought that was a really interesting quote, because you kind of, in many ways, highlight the aspirations of a lot of people who are more on the peace side of things, realizing the sacrifices that might need to be taken. But I'd love for you to comment on this, and whether you look at the next few weeks, months, years in an optimistic tone, or whether having been in development and having been in the throes of geopolitics and the UN for such a long time, whether you've reached a point where you're looking at it more from a pessimistic perspective or an optimistic one.
Let me mention two things. First, immediately in the Israel-Gaza war, those Israelis, and that includes this current government and the cabinet, that believe that Israel has the right, and they would say a God-given right, to rule over the Palestinian people or over the Palestinian territories, is the essence of this conflict. And it's unacceptable. And the people of Israel need to live side by side with the Palestinians in peace, and it's perfectly possible to do. But they have to give up their aspiration to rule all of the land. And some Israelis believe that's what the book of Joshua gave them, or some biblical interpretation. And it has to be put aside. Nobody has that right. Not from God, not from a book of the Bible. People have to live decently. and they have to respect each other. And that's the only way we can survive on this planet. When it comes to the United States, it's even more grandiose. The United States ideology is, and Biden repeated it recently, the US is the indispensable country. It's the country the world looks to for leadership. This is false. It was always false. But in the heyday of the 1990s, when the Soviet Union ended, maybe there was maybe that delusion could be at least a little understood. Is the US really the country the whole world's looking to right now when it stands alone against the rest of the world? Of course not. The US needs to learn to cooperate. It needs to learn to put aside its own delusion of hegemony. There are leaders, in fact, it includes this very government, Biden, Sullivan, Blinken, Nuland, who really believe in US hegemony. Well, it's a nonsense. It's a fiction. It's worse than an anachronism, because an anachronism would imply that it was maybe once true. It was never true. And so this is the similar kind of terrible falsehood that needs to be put aside if we're going to get to peace.
Doctor, last word. Is the UN time for reshuffling, time to restructuring, time for new laws for the UN to be more effective, to be able to defend these people? It's time for change in the UN?
Well, I love the UN, first of all, as frustrating as it is, because it is the place where the world meets, and it's the only place where the world meets. And when the world meets, it speaks with a huge voice, peace and justice for Palestine. So it's pretty impressive. Now, it has a voice, but it doesn't have an army. It doesn't have its own tax authority. It is a club of 193 nations. It was founded by nations. It was founded by nations. This is important. It's not global government. It's United Nations. And this is a bit of a problem. I'm in favor of more power, for example, some direct tax power, so that at the global level, we can get some funding for poor people or for emergencies or for other things that we need. Now, next September, there will be a summit of the future at the UN. This is a once in a generation. In fact, it's the first time ever that such a summit has taken place. And Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called on the world, think about what we want and what we need for the balance of the 21st century. And we will meet the 22nd and 23rd of September. By then, hopefully there will actually be some creative agreements reached about the kind of restructuring or strengthening of a new multipolar world and a stronger set of UN institutions that can work for the 21st century. So I'm a believer. I know in history, we've never had global governance. This is only the second attempt in all of world history to have this. The first was the League of Nations. It failed within a generation. The United Nations is 78 years old this year. It is, as I say, I love it, and it's incredibly frustrating that we can't solve more problems in the way we need to. But we should understand this is a new attempt in human history to have global scale governance. So I don't want us to give up on it. I don't want us to be cynical about it. I want us to fix things so that we can actually make it work. The answer is quite simple. The United States does not want to stop the wars. In fact, the United States is the enabler of so many wars around the world. It's really tragic. When it comes to the war in Gaza right now, if the United States stopped providing munitions to Israel, the war would end in a day. This war literally continues only because Israel gets munitions from the United States. It's not even out of stockpiles, it's out of new deliveries all the time. So if the United States took the choice perforce the fighting would stop. Of course, if the United States took political decisions, not vetoing UN Security Council resolutions, abiding by UN Security Council resolutions calling for a two-state solution, I think that on political grounds, the war in Gaza could end essentially immediately. I talked about other wars, just to mention them quickly. The war in Syria, which has gone on since 2011, is a U.S. regime change operation gone wrong, as most of them do, in a very deep way. It was decided by the U.S. and some of the regional partners that they would bring down Bashar al-Assad. And President Obama gave a famous finding, the Timber Sycamore operation of the CIA to bring down Assad. It failed, but it has caused 12 years of nonstop war. And I know through my work in the UN that that war could have ended in 2012, but the US blocked the solution to the war. There was an agreement to end the war, but the United States said, no, Assad must go or the war continues. Similarly, I talked about the Ukraine war. This is a completely misunderstood war because of the US narrative, which is false. This is a war caused by the US overthrow of the Ukrainian government in February 2014, followed by, and for the purpose of, and followed by an attempt until today to extend NATO to the border of Russia. And Russia, understandably, in my view, completely understandably, would not have it. And so this is a war over NATO enlargement. If the United States said any moment, NATO will not expand to Ukraine and to Georgia, by the way, which was put as a pair with Ukraine, the war would end. In fact, it almost did end in April 2022, weeks after the start of Russia's special military operation, because that whole invasion in February 2022 was designed not to take over the country, but to force Ukraine to the negotiating table, which it did. Zelensky and the Ukrainian government negotiated a peace with Russia based on neutrality, and the United States stepped in and said, no way you're signing that. And the war has continued since then. So these are wars of choice. They are wars, in my view, of an American empire, a very misguided one. I'm an American. This is a government that is not serving my purposes at all. It's wasting my money and it's killing a lot of people. So I find it all disgusting. I can tell you, and I don't mean to sound absurdly personal about it, but no government's ever asked me about this in the sense that these issues are not publicly debated in the United States. The causes of the wars are hidden from view. The narratives officially are lies. The votes on funding the wars are pushed through Congress almost without public debate. And so public opinion plays almost no role. So this is another sad part of this. But the long answer to your short question is these are wars of choice that the United States could stop immediately, but for various political and geopolitical reasons, chooses not to stop at the great cost for humanity and at the great cost for risks of further escalation.
So I'd like to pick up on the cost side of things. Clearly, you know, the United States has had to pay a hefty price tag in most of its wars, to the tune of trillions, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, etc. And you know, at home, there's a lot of political pressures that are being exerted. Now, specifically as it pertains to the Israeli-Gaza war, these pressures have really flooded into the streets, maybe not to that degree with respect to the Ukraine or some of the other wars, but with the Israeli-Gaza war, I mean, we've seen, manifestations in LA, in New York, even from all sorts of communities, Palestinian, even Jewish communities, all kinds of communities. And some of them are basically starting to question verbally, like never before, these kinds of policies that the U.S. administration, is undertaking. I think even the State Department has had some may I call it clandestine, because they had their faces covered in front of the White House manifestations so that they're not under any risk, but kind of to also object to the current policies of the United States. Would you be able to kind of shed a little bit to your opinion on how much that's playing a part in what appears to be a shift in U.S. policy from October 7th to today? And is that trend going to continue going forward in your opinion, or is there something that's going to hamper it and not allow it to go any further?
So I think there are two parts to the question, if I might. First is a bit about the costs financially, and then the costs politically. The costs financially of the U.S. wars of choice in the 21st century really dated to 9/11, if we might: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Ukraine, and many other smaller wars as well. Come to, according to different estimates, somewhere between $5 and $8 trillion. Even for a macroeconomist like myself, that's not small change. This is 25% or 33% from a quarter to a third of the U.S. annual output. Now, the reason that these wars have been able to be prosecuted at such cost and with no positive results for America or for the world is that they've been run on credit. If an American president said, "We want to fight the war, and we're going to raise your taxes to do it," the wars would end in one moment. So these are wars that are fought on deficit finance. The debt has been rising. The U.S. debt, public debt, that is, the debt owed by the Treasury, measured as a share of our U.S. national income, has increased from about 35% of our national income to about 100% of our national income between the year 2000 and today. This is a huge increase of debt, but it is not noticed up front because it is adding to the tab that's coming due. It's not an immediate burden. And similarly, of course, if there was even a breath of anything like a draft of actually Americans serving in any of these wars by a draft, they would also end in a moment, because the public doesn't support any of this. But these are wars that presidents are able to carry out essentially on their own personal authority, with a bit financed by Congress. Why? Because it's not noticed by the American people, and it's very popular with the military-industrial complex. After all, these wars are big business. This is no question part of the story. You have Boeing, you have Lockheed Martin, you have Northrop Grumman, you have General Dynamics, you have Raytheon, 5 big companies that have hundreds of billions of dollars of arms contracts. And they spread that back to Congress, especially to the Armed Services Committee. So we have a can I say, a shitstorm in our politics because it's so corrupt now. And even, I shouldn't say even, Biden, who is not a very impressive politician to say the least, in trying to make the case for aid actually doesn't make the case in terms of ethics, morality, safety, security, but he shows where the weapons are being produced and where the jobs are in the different congressional districts. So it's pretty crude stuff. Now, again, the American people would not tolerate any direct burden of this. So all of this is done on the side. Most people don't follow and don't really feel the budget deficits, except recently in the last couple of years, interest rates have gone up a lot. US credit ratings have come down. House prices, mortgage costs are going up. So people are starting to also even make that financial link, even though all of this is debt financed. They're saying, you know, I'm feeling the pain from this. And of course, if they factor in the trillions of debt that is going to have to be paid in the future by taxes or by inflation, they would feel it even more. But this is starting to be felt, and it's one of the reasons why Congress pushed back in recent months, not just what they would normally do of signing the bill, but a lot of congressmen saying the price is too high, even in a financial sense. Now, when you come to the political ramifications, which you asked about, this is absolutely fascinating, because the assumption of American politics for the last 50 years has been that it is always right for any politician to hone completely to Israel's point of view, because you have the Israel lobby, you have AIPAC, you have campaign contributions, you have not only Jewish voters, but you have Christian fundamentalist voters who, for their own theological reason, are even sometimes more strongly pro-Israel, quote unquote, if only to accelerate the Armageddon, by the way. But they're more pro-Israel in their voting than even the Jews sometimes. But the point is, the assumption of American politics, the training of politicians, is never show any space with Israel. And Biden, who's an old man and operates, I'd say, about 30 years out of date, and has a training that reflects the 1990s. This is his position, which is standing up for Israel no matter what. And so that's the normal politics. What has been the huge surprise for these politicians, I think a shock actually, is that young people aren't buying into it. So we have a tremendous generational change. It's not a change across the board in public opinion. It's really the under 35s primarily. Our students on the campuses, our students are looking at mass murder and saying, what the hell is this? Why are we complicit in this? And when they then protest, the donors to the university and the congressmen go crazy. You know, how dare the students say something against Israel? And it's been a huge shock to the older powers that be in the United States that this doesn't play. And Biden is finding he's losing support, a lot of support right now, by virtue of this knee-jerk, unconditional support for Israel, which has always been the formula for a Biden-like politician. It doesn't work anymore. This generational change is a very deep one. It's not going to go away. There's very little sympathy among younger people, and that's both Jews and non-Jews, by the way, though, of course, the proportions will vary in different groups. But a lot of young Jews are incredibly unhappy about what Israel is doing. And our student bodies more generally on the campuses are really unhappy. And the campuses are the administrators and the donors who have always been like the US politicians, 100% pro-Israel, unquestioned, are extremely surprised at what's happening right now.
In Europe, we are seeing that new leaders that are coming to power in Netherlands, in Slovakia, we had Orban. They are against this war in Ukraine, against sending more aids, more weapons to Ukraine. How influential would that be on the U.S. foreign policy in Ukraine?
It's having an effect, obviously. Orban by himself blocked the formal approval of the next round of European assistance. Fico in Slovakia will be joining that cause. The government in the Netherlands is still being negotiated, but the party that came out number one, as you said, Wilders, is against further aid. Of course, the new Polish government is pretty gung-ho for more financial and military support to Ukraine. Things are dragging out, but most of Europe does their best to follow blindly the United States. This is really tragic, though all of these cracks in the foundation are clearly appearing. What's stunning is if you look up approval rating of world leaders, and one of the websites that reports weekly opinion polling, there's not a European leader that has a net positive approval rating. Most of them are incredibly unpopular. Scholz, Jonas Gahr Støre in Norway, Macron, hugely unpopular. Their promoting war is not winning public support. There's no one in Europe that has a net positive approval rating in this group of NATO boosters, not even close. And the ratings keep going down and down. Look what's happening to Scholz in Germany. It's a collapse of public support. And in the United States, Biden does not have public support for his foreign policy.
We know that Austria is trying to block the new package of sanctions on Russia. Is that possible that Austria can make some middle ground for both sides?
I think that more and more politicians in Europe are understanding this is wrong. It was a terrible mistake. It's not working. They generally are so beholden to the United States, or for one reason or another, afraid of it or bought off, that they don't say in public what they often say in private. But there are more European politicians coming to the fore, definitely saying we've got to stop this, and that will have an effect, not from one day to the next, but it's definitely coming. Similarly, in the United States, public opinion is gone for this. Congress, which listens to the military-industrial complex, is in angst because they want to vote more money for weapons. The Democrats want to support Biden, but it's completely wrong-headed to be sending tens of billions of dollars more without even an attempt at negotiations. So I think that this is a failing policy that will come to an end. It has to, and doesn't have to, but it's very likely to in 2024. But it's agonizingly slow. And what is so frustrating is the absence of many voices of sanity. Viktor Orban in Hungary is one of them. Fico is a voice of sanity. There are very few right now.
As you mentioned, the U.S. foreign policy is so important. What's happening to the Democratic Party? We know that Cornel West, Jill Stein, even Bobby Kennedy, they're not welcome in the Democratic Party. They have to find their way of fighting in the new election. What the Democratic Party is losing for the next election? How do you see their situation?
Well, I'll give you a personal answer. They lost my vote. I used to be a Democrat. I used to vote Democratic basically all my life. And I have left the party. And I put it in personal terms because I think I reflect a view that is quite widespread. The Democratic Party for me is unrecognizable right now. When I joined the Democrats, I joined originally in the 1960s as I was still in high school, so I was a kid. But the idea was it was at least the part of our political system that was against the Vietnam War. And there was always a strong leftist part of the Democratic Party that was anti-war. And that was what I felt was my home. Now there isn't any anti-war part of the Democratic Party at all. Not in the Congressional Democratic Party, not in the White House. You don't find, other than a very, very few people, any voice for this right now. All the mainstream voices are more war, more funding. The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer was at school same time I was at Harvard. I've known him for many, many decades. What's his role right now? Well, keep the Senate in session so that we can still send more money to Ukraine. It's terrible. There's no thinking anymore. It's incredibly ignorant. And this is across the Democratic Party. So it's really quite upsetting.
Is the political arena of the United States ready to have a third party, even fourth party? We have Bobby Kennedy, who was not welcome in the Democratic Party. I don't know what they're thinking of, but he has a very good chance of getting more votes from the Democratic Party. We have Cornel West and Jill Stein. Those are so important candidates to make some equilibrium within the Democratic Party.
I think the mainstream Democrats are extremely confused and befuddled, and the wrong message, and they've lost their way. And Biden is a terrible candidate and has been basically a warmonger during this whole period. So it is a position that is outside of American public opinion right now. They've opened the door more for Trump than just about anything else. I sensed it from the beginning that, strangely, because it's a principle of American politics that foreign policy is not decisive, I said, you're going to go down on the foreign policy, which is really something. It was so bad, so misconceived. I wrote a few articles about that this makes no sense, even politically, much less geopolitically, if I could put it that way. It makes no sense in terms of domestic politics. And this is how things are playing out right now. The American public rejects Biden's foreign policy. He is not going to win re-election, most likely, and certainly not on this approach.
And I want you to specifically comment on Cornel West and Jill Stein. Because
they're fine people. They're not going to be president, most likely. They're fine people. Bobby Kennedy has a much larger following and a much larger position in the polls. And we'll see what the dynamics are now. Cornel West is a wonderful person. I've been friendly with him for decades. I don't know Jill Stein personally. But it's Bobby Kennedy that has the name, the public recognition, the position in the opinion polls, and he certainly has an open chance. I urge him all the time: be the candidate of peace. You'll win if you're the candidate of peace. This is really important. This is what the American people want.
Is it possible for him to convince Cornel West or even Jill Stein to be part of his campaign?
Well, I think right now, they're each going to do their thing. They're each going to run. We're still almost a year away from the election, so a lot can happen between now and next November, and we'll see. But for the moment, they're going to campaign, and right now, Bobby Kennedy shows up in the opinion surveys typically between 10 and 20% of support. That's a lot for a third party candidate. And we're early days because most Americans are not really focused on the elections. This is still very much a professional politician thing at this point, and it will only start to heat up at the beginning of next year with primaries and caucuses, and then we'll see how things evolve.
Just before wrapping up this session, I want to know your opinion on this U.S. economic war on China. How is it going with these two conflicts in Ukraine and in Israel? We know that China is they're doing their way, they're growing. And how do you see right now in the U.S.? Are they focused on the economy? Are they focused on these wars? How these wars going to benefit the economy?
It is pretty much taken for granted among the mainstream of both the Democratic and the Republican parties, I have to say, that China's an enemy. And the rhetoric vis-a-vis China is extremely stupid, low-level, ignorant, and dangerous. And this is both parties, because even parts of the Republican Party that are not interested in the Ukraine war or want to stop the funding to a significant extent say, yes, because we need the resources to fight China. And so there's a kind of comic book feeling to it that, oh, there could be a war with China. That would just be fine and dandy. Of course, it could end the world. It's so reckless and dangerous, the way that our politicians talk, the way the mainstream media report things, say, yeah, coming war with China, as if that's, a normal kind of statement, as opposed to something absolutely horrifying. And the rhetoric about Taiwan, as if Taiwan is the 51st American state, as if the United States doesn't have a one China diplomatic policy, which they seem to forget. It's all quite dangerous. The U.S., starting with Obama in political ways, starting with Trump in trade policies, and now with Biden in trade policies, finance policies, technology policies, is really leaning hard against China. It's doing some damage to Chinese macroeconomics in the short term, because it's really stopped the growth of China's exports to the U.S. market, and Europe has broadly gone along with this. And so that is hurting a bit, but I think China has ways around that, including expanding its role in the non-US, non-EU world, and I expect that to happen. China's underlying strengths for growth are very strong. It's a high-saving society with excellent education and very strong research, development, and enterprises that are at the cutting edge of many technologies, whether it's electric vehicles or renewable energy or advanced computation. China has great depth and strength. So this is not a fly-by-night economy. This is a very, very serious and sophisticated economy with a lot of geopolitical support. And I don't think the United States can, quote, contain China. It's a terrible idea, an absurd idea, a dangerous idea.